Welcome to
Hi.
Law and Liberation. We're here with Jennifer Ching, who's the Executive Director of North Star Fund. She's a passionate advocate for social justice with extensive experience as a lawyer, nonprofit leader, teacher, and organizer. Today, we talk about the role of philanthropy and social justice movements. Welcome, Jen.
Hi. So great to be here.
Thank you. So let's start with your personal journey and to give listeners your perspective. Can you share briefly your trajectory to your current position at the North Star Fund?
Sure. I think a lot of folks, when they hear lawyer went into some form of philanthropic role, they have a story that pops into their mind, like, oh, unhappy lawyer wants to go kind of, do good. But actually, as with many things, it was a pretty complicated journey for me. I would say the first thing I would open with is my lineage. My lineage really owes a great debt to the Asian American organizing movement. I was a young person who really came up thinking a lot about service and worked in a number of service type roles, soup kitchen, tutoring. And it was at one of those roles where I happened to see a flyer when I was 18 for a youth organizing program at Asian American Resource Workshop in Boston. It was a paid job, it was a paid gig. So I was like, oh, let me apply to this. And the amazing thing was that organization and that organization's deep connection to the role of building working class solidarity-based Asian American community organizing. It transformed my life. They gave me a structural starting point to understand my own family's experience, to understand the ways in which things that we had kind of pushed as if you work hard, you'll do good, work hard, you're fine, this is a meritocracy. They just gave me a sense of structural, economic, racial, gender issues. And from there, I really found a home. So I came up through working and organizing with various worker centers and in the sort of crossover between the immigrants' rights movement and the labor movement. And I loved being an organizer. But as an individual who came from a family with significant financial insecurity, I knew, or at least I felt that I thought I knew that my professional path had to take me somewhere different. So, like many folks, I applied to law school and I thought, I'm going to be a lawyer and organizer. I'm speaking to a sister here on that. And, and I ended up working for many years as a lawyer in support of movements, but also across different sectors, public sector, private sector, teaching. I tr in back in service and supporting communities, grassroots work. And all along the way, as I worked as an attorney for over 20 years, felt a deep split. The split was actually not even within myself. What I saw was the financialization of poverty. What I saw was more and more in any setting where I was in, the lawyers would take the lion's share of the resources. And by resources, I mean all sorts of things: capital, I mean cultural resources, I mean strategic resources. And sort of the movement organizers, the people who are actually building the base, the people who are actually making transformative connections across communities, and particularly working with folks who are most directly impacted by injustice, were receiving like pennies on the dollar.
Mm.
And I'm a very pragmatic person. And so I began to just sort of feel like this should be inversed, right? Like, if we really want there to be durable, lasting change, and we really want structural change, then really the world of organizing needs to be much more deeply resourced. And I was someone who, was comfortable understanding and mobilizing resources, right? I'm not the kind of person who's like, oh, hi, I hate to fundraise. I'm like, no, no, no. We're taking back what's ours. Right? Money was extracted. It needs to be free flow back into communities. So I
Mm.
had all of this sort of thinking. And when Donald Trump was first elected in 2017 and when he was running, I I think there was quite a bit of focus on lawyers, right? There was a lot of like, lawyers are going to save us. This is the time we're going to like litigate. We're going to really, but I had already experienced as a lawyer, a young lawyer under the Bush administration, the total eradication of the rule of law. And I had a real sense of having seen how the right was moving, that I did not have faith that our sort of judicial or intralegal institutions were going to last. And so I kind of just had a mic drop moment and chose to leave the law. This role at North Star Fund came open, and it was for me a true homecoming, both to be here in New York, supporting movements, many of which that I had interacted with or worked or learned from over decades. And then also getting a chance to make visible and make complicated the legacy of money and how money moves to movements, how, as what Megan Ming Francis says, how philanthropy and power captures movements, how we have actually, in many ways as lawyers, unduly shaped movements. And so to now be in a role where my job is to resource liberation in as a responsible way as possible. It's been among my most intellectually challenging and also very gratifying work.
Thank you so much. I think it's really important that you share your trajectory and journey because it gives many of us sort of insights into how the different decisions that you made, and also that your origin story is with organizing. I think that's really sort of important to pinpoint. I think you've mentioned this already, but how have these experiences informed your philanthropy work today? I love the phrase you have of resourcing liberation. So I was wondering if you can maybe, if there were other things you wanted to add about how has this experience that you charted informed your philanthropic work today at North Star?
Yeah, North Star Fund is not a typical foundation. So when you think about what philanthropy is, a lot of people, when they think about philanthropy, they think about little p philanthropy, like it's acts of generosity. It's the system by which people give. Isn't that so wonderful? Who doesn't want to be a part of that? But philanthropy is actually big P. It is itself a financial system, right? It is a financial system that was constructed to benefit the wealthy. It has sort of the side effect of course, funding work that should probably be in the public fund commons. And, it is a bizarre thing that we rely on private actors to fund the essential survival of so many members of our society. So philanthropy as a big P is an economic system. It is an economic system that is sort of underwritten and protected by wealthy interests. And it is a system where the majority and the vast majority of the decisions about its resources are owned by the wealth holders themselves. So North Star Fund was founded in a different way. We were founded in the late 1970s after the municipal crisis in New York City, in a time of significant movement and significant grassroots organizing in the city across many of the issues that are familiar to us today: transnational solidarity, housing rights, criminal justice reform, ending mass incarceration, ending endless wars. And the people who found North Star Fund were both individuals who had access to wealth, but also just grassroots organizers. And what they decided was we should really just upend the way we do things. We should raise dollars. Those dollars should not go sit in a endowment where they never move anywhere. They should go straight back into the community. And the people who make the decisions should be organizers themselves, should be the people who are of the closest proximity to communities that are fighting to end injustice. So that kind of for the shift for me and the way that I think and practice philanthropy, well, it's truly been a values alignment because I was interested in understanding how can we actually democratize and shift power meaningfully, both in how we resource movements, but also how we build movements, how we build the sort of like public sector. So So for me personally, being at North Star Fund has been a great learning journey about all the different ways that the sort of power infrastructures that we just accept as given are actually imposed on us. And we actually have the ability to change the way, not just how money moves, but how we make decisions about it. So again, at North Star Fund, grassroots organizers make our funding decisions, but they are also part of our governance, right? And so we are thinking about what it is to rethink the role of money, but also the role of people to make change and to take risks that ordinarily wouldn't happen in the philanthropy big piece system.
Great. You already began to talk about North Star's philosophy. You've written on, and or others have talked about this idea of trust-based and people-centered philanthropy. Can you describe what that means in just definitionally first, and then what that means in practice?
Yeah, there has been a tremendous movement, I would say maybe over the past decade, to think about how philanthropy can repair harms that the system has been a part of, and what role do the range of sort of philanthropic giving communities have to reconstruct a different path towards a more equitable practice of funding. At its most base, if you think about sort of what trust-based philanthropy means, it means that in many situations there's very little trust between the people who hold the money and the people who receive the money, right? If you've fundraised before, you have to jump through a million hoops, that you have to sometimes not say certain things, sometimes say other things, right? It's a game. And sometimes it's a game in which people compromise their values, their mission, their vision, because they've got to keep the lights on. And so trust-based philanthropy is about how do we alter those conditions and build relationships of trust. Many people just will confuse trust-based philanthropy with the idea of, oh, it just means you give general operating gifts, gifts without restrictions, or you make multi-year commitments so people can have a predictive stream of income. Those are, I think, the baseline practices. If you have resources, right, to trust the individual or group with whose work you are supporting. But the movement itself, I think, is also reflective back on philanthropy. Like, what are you actually doing to shift power meaningfully? What are you actually doing to move resources towards social justice movements? What are you doing to actually change the structural conditions in which either you have or have earned the money, or the way in which you are moving it? And so at North Star Fund, we're known for two things. One is, as I said, we practice our philanthropy through all volunteer community organizing. We call them community funding committees. So the organizers are organized across different spaces. We operate one in New York City, one in the Hudson Valley. One operates for our Let Us Breathe Fund, which is the only New York-based fund led by Black organizers supporting Black-led grassroots organizing. And then we have a fund that we started quite recently that funds statewide grassroots coalition work.
Mhm.
And so one difference there is that at North Star Fund, we are really facilitating the movement of dollars. We are not saying to ourselves, we have an interest in this, and we're just so angry about this issue. So we're gonna, open up this fund to do this. We are responsive to and accountable to grassroots organizing, including our grantees, former grantees, prospective grantees, emerging groups, people who are interested in making structural change in New York. So that information is what guides us to, as I say, sort of share power, seed power, move power differently. Across philanthropy, I think also when you think about what is trust-based or people-powered philanthropy, it's not just about the practice of moving the resources, right? It must also be about the reparative framework and understanding under which any institution operates. So what is the history of your particular institution? What are you doing to unwind or repair the harm that probably lives and is cited across multiple generations, right? I mean, New York is in many ways a founding site for American philanthropy. So the history runs deep here where the money comes from. So I think that too is part of it, that institutions have a lot to examine, and we're not above that. I would never say that North Star Fund, oh, we've perfected, radical philanthropy. No such thing, right? Like anytime you have people together and they have control of resources, there's going to be challenges in how you think about the right use of power. And so learning to interrogate those challenges and learning to think very pragmatically how you move from a place of academic investigation to what it actually means, how you are funding. That's the journey that I think trust-based and sort of people-powered philanthropy is on. And the only other thing that I would, oh, sorry. The only other thing that I would add is people-powered philanthropy also means a certain thing. Movements have never been wholly funded, right? Very famous saying from the 1980s, the revolution will not be funded, right?
Mhm.
Movements for change, radical movements, transformative movements, spaces where working class communities of color have really come together and charted a different course for New York, let alone the world. These are not fully philanthropic funded in any way. People, communities, working class communities have always funded their own work. And so part of the work at North Star Fund also is to talk about philanthropy and to build a cross-class philanthropic movement, to make that visible
Mhm.
and to make it powerful and to provide the resources for people to be what we call grassroots fundraisers. So we also operate programming that is about building the strength, the fortitude, and the space for people to be raising resources from across the world. It's not, philanthropy is not just about poor person gets money from rich person. It is about the entire ecosystem of money, resources, cultural wealth, capital wealth, shared wealth that is driving and supporting mutual aid, structural organizing campaigns, all the work that is needed to keep communities truly safe and to allow them the space to envision what we collectively term a liberatory future.
And I wanted to go back to this idea that you said about building a public sector, and you've also just right now talked about building a infrastructure that, enables movements to be self-determined and empowered. Can you say a little bit about that? Because most of philanthropy sort of narrative is, maybe at best this private partnership, kind of working together. And it seems that what you're saying is that you're actually moving resources towards like changing the public sector and its responsibilities. So I just wanted to understand a little bit more because I think that's something new that I haven't heard in the discussion, even amongst radical philanthropy, that they still keep the public-private distinction intact.
We're talking on the day before a pretty consequential election in New York City. And so, not knowing the outcome, I would say there are two things though that I've been thinking about. That There are two things that I've been thinking about over the past year that I think are very relevant to this question about how philanthropy shows up in redefining what a public sector, what a public commons, what a multiracial democracy looks like. The first is that when people who are most proximate and most directly impacted by whatever injustice they choose to address, when they are the ones who determine the strategy and determine the infrastructure and design the work that it takes to change conditions, to really change material and cultural conditions, it's a whole different playing field, right? When we have spaces that are not content with merely incremental change that is appeasable and accepted by the mass public, we have a real chance at dialogue for transformation, right? I am so I have been so lucky to have lived in a time and to have learned from so many movement spaces, whether we look at the emergence of Black Lives Matter or we look at the role of Palestinian liberation movements, um, to learn to see when folks who face every single structural opposition can still find a place to meaningful solidarity and discipline to change conditions for all. So I think that's like one bucket that I live with and learn from. The second is what does it actually mean to your question about a public sector? Like, what does it actually mean to co-govern? What is the role of organizing in and the sort of firmament of a multiracial democracy? Right? Now, I'm someone who has always sort of, found my voice outside of formal government, but that doesn't mean that those are not the most powerful institutions that we have to reckon with and understand. And what we have seen and experienced in New York is tremendous, I would say, over the past 10 years, but really throughout New York's history, right, are organizers who come up through a community campaign of some kind, find themselves going from streets to state house. That's something that we talk a lot about at North Star Fund, that we all have a role. Some of us have a role in the streets, some of us have a role in the state house, some of us have a role in the background, just mobilizing resources so that folks can move and act more freely. But that circularity of what it means to hold people accountable once they come into institutional power, that's, I think, the biggest question. What does it mean in a multiracial democracy? Does not mean that everyone in government looks like you, but what it means is there is an interactive accountability of power. And that's a skill that organizers need to learn, right? Organizers are never going to be as deeply pocketed or funded as private lobbyists and all the folks that you see walking the halls of Albany and City Hall. And so organizers have to use people power and have to use their transformative kind of movement bases, build out, build up, and build with. And I think those two questions really are the questions that philanthropy should be wrestling with instead of the sort of ways in which I think philanthropy has generally been structured, which is to merely be responsive to perhaps a current need or define the need themselves.
Yeah, I think in your definition, you're really talking about shifting power and building new structures. But and many organizers have talked about the tension in doing that. And previous interviewees have talked about the nonprofit industrial complex. You cited to the revolution will not be would be funded is another insight resource. How does North Star navigate this tension at the end of the day, you are a funder and philanthropist organization, and also this desire to shift the conversation. And also like how are you placed within the larger philanthropic ecosystem?
Um, you know, we are tiny, right? We are like a beep, 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 beep when compared to the trillions of dollars that flow in philanthropy, big P, right? But we know our lane, we know our role. And we try and just focus on that and let the other static go, right? For almost 50 years, our fund has been responsible for being a public, openly accessible fund to all New Yorkers who are interested in changing some sort of condition they see impacting their community. Time and time again, generation after generation, our community funding committee members, many of whom come from very well established, nonprofit based organizing groups, say to us, the role of this fund is to seed fund the newest and most emerging groups. And that's really what we try and do, is to build the pipeline of long-lasting leadership in a very relentless and difficult atmosphere. It's expensive to live in New York City. It's expensive to work in New York City and New York State. It's expensive to organize, right? So we try to keep that pipeline open of emerging leaders, workers, organizers, community members together. We are not defining what are the issues du jour, what are the priorities of the moment. That is fully defined by the movements that are coming to seek support from us.
Hmm.
Through their work with us, we hope to be a responsible steward in supporting leadership, building the growth of programs, however groups choose to define the work as they move into the future. Some will become nonprofits, some may not. Some will institutionalize to a significant level, some may not. Some may decide to run a more sort of traditional legislative campaign or a policy campaign. Others will not. But the point is to keep the sort of movement building and the base building and the political education space as alive as we can in a time when in a time which I mean not even just the past year, in a time generationally when so many resources are not flowing in this direction and so many funders and philanthropists do not believe in social justice movements.
I know you are, focused on staying in your lane, but to what extent have has North Star tried to talk with other sort of philanthropists or philanthropy organizations on your philosophy of people-centered, about power, about resource mobilization? Are those conversations happening?
Yes, so staying in our lane, when I say we're staying in our lane, that doesn't mean we're staying quiet. And one of the things about North Star Fund that's really important to us, that's part of our lane, is to make this work and this vision accessible to anyone and everyone. We are organizers also, right? So that's the thing. If you join North Star Fund, you're not joining just because, oh, it feels good, I want to give money away. It's not a passive community. We're asking everyone who's a part of our work to also organize. We are an invitational space. We think a lot about how to make social justice movements a part of the daily conversation in New York and beyond, within philanthropy and beyond. Everybody has a role to play. If you want to change things around you, if things are not fair around you, plug in. So that's part of our lane. Our lane is to also make organizing joyful to folks. That, there is such a misinterpretation of social justice in the sort of in the common American narrative that it's a place where people go merely just to be angry, as opposed to it's a space where we grow, where we care for each other, where we really learn to care across all kinds of differences, where we learn to have really constructive but also difficult conversations, and where we really learn how our futures are intertwined with each other's. That is the joy of liberation. And so people giving money and us giving money and moving money is really just a fraction of the community building that we believe we are a part of. Bringing movements together, bringing people together to really understand that social justice movements are a part of all of us. It's part of our common legacy and history. And so, how great is it to think that we could all share this future together, shaping a different New York, a New York where we can all thrive?
This series is a, about public education, and a lot of terms are utilized in movement spaces, and we want to kind of break those into more accessible understanding. The term decolonizing philanthropy is increasingly used. Is that something that you use at North Star? Um, what exactly is it? What does that look like? Is that something that's desirable for us in this in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The question of decolonizing philanthropy is something that we have actually wrestled with and interrogated openly. In fact, between, I would say, 2017 to 2020, in the first Trump administration, we came together as a community and very plainly stated that part of the mission of North Star Fund is to dismantle white supremacy as it appears not just within philanthropy, but within our own organization. At the time, that was a time, I mean, it's hard to believe that, how much history we have lived in the past, less than decade. But that was controversial. People were very uncomfortable with the naming of white supremacy and white nationalism and what decolonizing the history of philanthropy meant at that time. Of course, there have been folks like Edgar Villanueva, there have been generations of Native activists and thinkers who have really talked about and centered the word decolonizing as a very specific practice around reparation, repair, meaningful structural change around how our institutions even exist, let alone the land that we are on. So I would say it's not something that we throw around lightly. I think we have learned ourselves that shifting power does not mean, oh, we have decolonized philanthropy. Rethinking power and the right use of power in the philanthropic context does not mean we have decolonized our minds and we have liberated all resources. It's an iterative, ongoing conversation and wrestling where we have to understand all the entry points by which we can behave with a reparative lens, but also shift and move our values collectively. And then what comes next is the vision of building. So many times people think about terms like decolonizing, dismantling as, well, you just want to break it down. What are you actually going to build in its stead?
Mm.
That's also part of our lane, to reference your earlier question. That's also part of our work. Our work is to give people and move resources to people who we believe have the vision and can actually change and rethink all of the ways in which we govern, the way we live, the way we care for each other, the way we keep each other safe and secure. So I think I don't want to, I realize maybe I'm sounding abstract, but these all have very real implications. When you have a mayoral campaign that is saying things like free public transit or keep housing costs level frozen, right? These are enormous challenges to the economic system and the power system that we have all largely come to accept
Mhm.
is privatized, and that we as a collective pay for. But what does it mean when we actually upend all of that and we envision a world which is just much different? So I think spaces like this and terms like that are terms like decolonizing are very useful because they are asking you to think about the sort of colonizing mind frame, the way in which we have just accepted an international power structure, a contemporary power structure, a historic power structure. We take all those things as a given, and what does it mean to actually transform?
I- I would like us to, if possible, to concretize what that looks like. Um, can you share maybe one or two practices or policy initiatives that kind of leads us in this sort of direction of decolonizing philanthropy, maybe through the work that you're doing at North Star or the work that you're observing movement organizations are doing, just to and you mentioned free buses and the sort of mayoral platform, right? Economic platform is maybe an example of that. But are there other examples that folks can like turn to understand?
Yeah, and so what does this question of decolonizing philanthropy, dismantling white supremacy within philanthropy, what does it actually look like or feel like? Um, I mentioned sort of like the policy agenda of, a mayoral candidate. I just mean that's like one end of sort of if you have a live conversation where people can actually advance very different sort of vision for society, we can even see it reflected, in the common conversation, right? That's exciting, but that's certainly not I would never say that that's the end of what we're trying to achieve. I mean, at its base, I think what we are talking about is how do we free the land, free the money, free the people? How do you really make resources under community control in just a different way? I sometimes I feel like I can't even envision that, right? Like, So at North Star Fund, we are trying to take the steps to do that, right? So even though it's not a romanticized notion, right? Community funding committees that operate within North Star Fund, there's a lot of work. There's a lot of labor, right, to steward resources responsibly. We have to do our own grounding in our political centering and understanding what is the power and control we have as a grant-making institution in the nonprofit industrial complex. How can we do our best to at least make those power dynamics visible, let alone retract them, let alone reverse them, right? So there's that. As I said, we have a lane, but I'm not saying our lane is the radical, this is not the end point. We're just part of this process, right? So everywhere we see, I think, movement groups thinking about how they create, for lack of a better term, independent revenue, member funded revenue, grassroots organizing campaigns that enable them to do things like own their own land or return land to members, to own the spaces that they are in. These are all parts of that path, right? It's not the end all, but these are the things that I think allows our movement spaces the chance to be in different relationship with, let's just talk for a moment, money, a different relationship with money and power. And we move from there. That does not mean North Star Fund, we are not pragmatic to the needs of the now. At base, we are always understanding, and at the end of the day, we are here to move as many resources into movements as possible. So some spaces, for example, don't accept money from certain, donors or things like that. No, we are an open space. We will take your money. A big joke with us is that we're money launderers. We will take your money. We will move it back into the control of community, right? All money in many ways is tainted, right? We've all been part of this particular system. We really want folks to come through North Star Fund, think differently about their relationship to money from every class, and really think about how we can together raise resources differently and move those resources differently.
I'm glad you talked about money and power. You write and speak on dismantling money and power, and you talked about that throughout this interview. I was wondering if you wanted to say anything additionally about how you think about sort of the linking of these two. I've read and heard you speak on this a number of times, and you have a particular perspective, and just wondered if we could share. What do you mean about dismantling money and power, and what does that look like?
Yeah, it's for me, money and power is the lifelong conversation. I grew up in a very class diverse family. As I said, my own parents struggled with sort of the traditional American dream, but I was never without basic resources and plus. I mean, I grew up in also as you can in the United States, I grew up in a very culturally rich class. I really had access to so much. And all my life, I've been working since I was 14. I've worked in so many different kinds of jobs, and from retail to restaurant to, office temp to then professional, what's on the resume versus what's not.
Mm,
And a lot of the times I think about how my life as a worker is my life as a journey to really navigate for myself money and power, to build a life where I could provide my own family, including my parents and my children, with just some economic freedom.
mm,
I've been thinking about that a lot because in the past couple weeks, my partner was just laid off. He's a victim of, as so many, of Trump reforms that made the work in his sector untenable. He works in climate, green energy.
mm,
And I find myself at 50 facing all of a sudden questions that my parents faced as their own American dream unraveled. And I think a lot about how twisted money and power becomes for all of us. And so at a place like North Star Fund, that is a place to interrogate that question. Why do we hoard wealth? And why do we hoard control and power when we have wealth? Why do we think, and wealth of any kind, right? And why do we feel like money we have is the money we were entitled to, is the money we earned? There's so much for me that I want to unpack about money and power for the rest of my life that I have been trying to. And I have the great sort of luxury and gift to be able to do some of that through work and to think about what would it have been like if the organizing work that I participated in as a young person was paid a living wage. And, there's groups like All Due Respect now that look at the organizing sector and are trying to build a living wage sector. But like, what would it have looked like if it was a sector that had the same economic benefits as other work that to me was far less intellectually engaging, right? What a path I might have chosen myself, in thinking about what transformation and the role of transformation I could play. I sound incredibly privileged and gross, I'll just say, because millions of people choose work that is meaningful, right? And do not choose to go into law or philanthropy because they're thinking about a quote unquote stable paycheck, etc. I've kind of walked the middle of that road a little bit because I've always chosen to be in nonprofit jobs that, where I'm the one trying to raise funds and things like that. So I think a lot about that distinction, what it means for someone like myself who always sat in a very uneasy nexus of money and power, who's now known, and my job is essentially to raise money, move power, raise money, move power, when all along I'm telling you, I have not come to my own understanding of it. I think that is what keeps it so real and powerful for me, is that my own place in the economy feels so tenuous, that I want to make a different life for not just my own children, but for the world that I see around me that is so unbelievably unbalanced.
Thank you so much for that. Really personal, but also reflective on these two structures that influence and determine our lives. Just to slowly wind down what's been a really powerful conversation, I wanted to ask you, well, what's the future of philanthropy? What's the future of funding? In the world that you're imagining, do funders are necessary? Is that the ultimate goal of social justice philanthropy, that you've moved all the resources and the money, movements are empowered, and therefore philanthropy is no longer necessary? What do you see as the future of this sector?
When people ask me what the future looks like, I always say, I I am not one who can define that. I always look to future generations. I truly do believe that growing up tethered to a certain systems and structures means um, the future you define has to be the responsibility that the generations ahead of you are telling you. So
Mm.
I listen to what youth, young people, folks coming up are telling us to unwind or undo and to unlearn ourselves as the current, power holders or stewards of whatever power, structural, economic, governmental, etc. Um, so I think about that a lot, that I'm mostly just in a place of unlearning and relearning new things. So the future is as of yet to be defined, but the core values of it, that it is certainly not what we have experienced in the past, and that it has, as you say, a different interrogation with money, power, oppression, yes, all those things. So that's like literally, I know that's so general, like, but that's what I think. Right. So I think a lot of people say, well, doesn't the whole nonprofit sector want to work itself out of a job? Doesn't philanthropy want to just spend itself down? Yes. And along the way, we want to make sure that we are seeding and creating the institutions that can endure into a different sort of future, ones that are more collectively built, collectively run, ones that have enduring resources, right? So it's not, I'm saying we throw a baby out with bathwater. What a terrible phrase, um, but that we learn from what we know structurally keeps conditions the same, and we unwind what we can right now and what we must, and then we continue to build. Um, yes. So do I hope someday that North Star Fund in its current iteration does not exist? Absolutely. But do I hope that whatever iteration it exists in is one that is in right relationship with movements and that is still building and practicing solidarity and teaching people and teaching ourselves to be in solidarity as a praxis and a practice? Yes, because I think that is just going to be a lifelong, futures long endeavor.
Thank you so much for that. This episode has been focused on social justice, radical philanthropy, as you described it. I've asked the questions thinking about, one thing that you would want listeners to take away from this interview or from your conversation, as Law and Liberation is a public education series, meaning not just lawyers or organizers who are familiar maybe with some of the terminology, but hopefully to reach a broader audience. Is there sort of one pressing thing or one thing that you want to just kind of put a emphasis point on or a pinpoint on?
Yes. Uh, we have so much to learn from democracy movements around the world, from movements that rose out of colonialism. I have so much to learn and have learned. One of the things that is the enduring and immediate lesson is we don't have time. We don't have time. The backslide into authoritarianism practices in the United States has been more rapid than I think anyone could have ever predicted. And the probability of stopping this backslide into further authoritarianism and fascism is like the probability is extremely low when we only rely on institutional channels like elections, courts, legislatures, right? We need to understand that a sustained civil resistance, which is rooted in movements for social justice, that a sustained civil resistance that finds true solidarity across the population is required to eradicate the power that is amassing very quickly across the authoritarian regime, which is the deepest funded pockets due to its partnership to the private sector. We have to upend that immediately, and it does not take much, right? Everybody talks about the 3.5%, that you only need a single digit percentage of the American populace or the international populace to participate in sustained civil resistance in order to actually stop this backslide. And our entries for this change, therefore, are very specific. We should be funding, supporting, and working and taking the leadership from grassroots movements. We should be understanding how working class movements in particular are designed and organized in the United States and what they are calling for rather, and where they are coming from. And we should be providing as much support as we can because across the world, we've learned time and time again that an organized civil society is the only antidote to authoritarianism.
I'm going to end with a question that I asked all interviewees. The series is called Law Plus Liberation. Um, what does liberation mean or look like to you personally, collectively, in your role at North Star, however you would like to locate yourself or define it? What does liberation mean and look like to you?
Yeah. I think liberation looks to me like a world where all essential needs are absolutely met and then some. And really, the edges of growth for all of us are our dreams. And we are just dream building every day. Our greatest challenges are to dream better ways to care for ourselves, those who perhaps are less able to, the earth, the land, that we construct communities that are 100% participatory from wherever folks come from, and 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 therefore like the resources are shared and not just distributed, but are collectively stewarded. When I think about that, I think about that that's the way I want my private life to be. Certainly the way I'd like my family to operate. I don't need an autocracy in my family. Sometimes I feel like I'm running one that way. Um, Yeah, and we all at core understand what being in right relationship with each other and the land and all of our sort of created resources are.
Thank you so much, Jen, for this really powerful conversation, for giving of your time. Um,
Thank you. It's always great to talk with you, Shantali.